You're listening to Thunderquack Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome back to Metaphysical Fiction. This is our second episode. I am one of your hosts, Michael Cohen, but I'm going to hand it over. We're going to get into it right away. We're going to talk about Wanda in the MCU in this episode, but I'm going to hand it off to the proper host, to the real host of this show, to Karl Leclerc.
Yeah, first off, you're far too kind. This is a joint effort. I'm so glad to get to have the conversation with you because I think you're going to have a lot of wisdom about some of the concepts we're going to talk about while we discuss Wanda Maximoff here. In like a quick aside, and obviously alluded to this, when we did our first episode, WandaVision is responsible for me falling in love with Marvel. This is what brought me in. I mean, I'd seen some of the movies, enjoyed them to varying degrees. But this story of this woman dealing with grief and the loss of so much in her life, that very human story drew me in specifically to WandaVision, but also to this wider mythos of like, there's so much going on. And this is obviously a very interconnected story. And I'm just about done as we're sitting here to record right now, Mike. I watched every Marvel movie from Age of Ultron through Endgame, many of them for the first time, and now I've been doing them in release order, and I've only got Captain Marvel and Endgame left, and I'm just absolutely loving these movies. But Wanda is a character specifically that I'm really astounded by, and what we're going to look at in this episode a little bit is kind of like we talked about in the first episode. We're going to look at a little bit of the religious connections. There's a lot of religious mythology embedded in this character. We're going to look at the power of grief and how that's so important to Wanda's story. And we'll end by looking at what are some of the lessons, right? Like, if all of these stories Mike and I are going to be discussing are mythological stories, they're trying to teach us something. So we'll get to kind of bounce around some of the ideas of what we think this character is teaching us through her own story. But Mike, this is where I need your help the most, especially is just kind of, who is Wanda? Who is she in the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Can you maybe give just like a brief snippet of like where she came from, even in the comics and stuff? Like just a little bit of the background on that character.
Yeah. So Wanda Maximoff, the Scarlet Witch, originated in the Avengers. So it's one of the reasons why, as a mutant character, she's actually allowed to be in the MCU, or what prior to the Fox acquisition was allowed to be. So basically, what happened is around the time that we were going into Age of Ultron, the second Avengers film, Marvel and Fox made a deal. Fox wanted to keep using Quicksilver because or maybe they were just about to introduce him as well. I'd have to look at that in the timeline. I don't know the X-Men movies as well as I know the MCU, but they wanted to use Quicksilver, right? And to great effect. I mean, like the Quicksilver sequences are one of the only redeemable things about those X-Men movies, the second batch of them, in my opinion. But they wanted to use him. They weren't going to use Scarlet Witch necessarily. So Marvel and Disney made a deal with them of like, hey, we're going to use Scarlet Witch. You guys can have Quicksilver. And so what's the first one? The first one is First Class, and then it's Days of Future Past, the second one, I think so. Whichever one introduced Quicksilver, they have like a real throwaway of like his little sister. But they did it very differently, where they're different ages and stuff. In the comics, they're twins. They are the twin son and daughter of Magneto. So they're directly related to the X-Men's arch nemesis. Although Magneto is kind of one of those nemesis that he's like, is he really a bad guy? Is he a good guy? Sometimes he's on the team. Sometimes he works with them. Sometimes they're fighting him. Sometimes he has a big asteroid. It's confusing. The X-Men is a whole other thing. But in the MCU, we don't have mutants. We don't have Magneto. We don't have any of that connection. So they introduced Wanda and Pietro in Age of Ultron, completely divorced from their X-Men mutant origins, and they created this whole other backstory, including this country Sokovia, which is not a real country; it's made up. Stay tuned to that, because I'm pretty sure where we're headed is that it's going to end up being Latveria, which is where Doctor Doom kind of hangs out. If you've been paying attention to Falcon and the Winter Soldier, there have been some hints that post the snap, things kind of started to change, and then after the blip, it's like we're trying to figure out where are borders, who has ownership of what, and I think a one Victor Von Doom might come in and sort of draw his own lines on the map, and I think that Sokovia might end up being sort of amalgamated into that. But they made up this whole, it was weird that they were like, we're gonna call it Sokovia, which is a very sort of like vaguely Eastern European USSR type of a country, right? And when they could have just done Latveria and started to set that, but actually that's not true. They didn't have access to the Fantastic Four stuff at the time, so that's probably why they did it. So yeah, they introduced these two characters kind of as bad guys, which is interesting because they do have origins in that within the Avengers. And so they're painted as nemesis to begin with, but we all knew, I mean, like, even the marketing material didn't shy away from the fact that, like, by the end of this movie they will be Avengers. like don't worry about it, Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch will be Avengers. Now, she's never called Scarlet Witch, she's called Wanda,
Right.
up until WandaVision. So but they're introduced in this really interesting way, which is that they're tied to an Infinity Stone, something that we didn't know was an Infinity Stone, which was what Loki's staff, right? His it was just called Loki's scepter in Avengers, but then we discover in Age of Ultron that it's actually got the Mind Stone inside of it, which is a really weird thing retroactively. It was a weird choice because then you go back to Thanos and like his whole mission. It's like, why did he give up one of the Infinity Stones if his whole thing was to collect them? But that's fine. We're gonna ignore that, because we've gotten so much cool mythology built around the fact that Wanda's powers are now tied to the Mind Stone, as is Vision, which that character as well, like his origin story is completely redeveloped for Age of Ultron as well. Obviously, Vision is always tied to Ultron and the Avengers. In the comics, Hank Pym has a lot more to do with Ultron and Vision, but Hank Pym hadn't been introduced yet. So, and the Hank Pym that we ended up getting is very different from the one in the comics, in terms of timeline. He's sort of one of those pre-Avengers, along with Howard Stark and Peggy Carter, and all of those characters. So like Age of Ultron really switched stuff up, but did what the MCU does so well, which is that it remained true to the heart of the stories. So even if they come from Sokovia, their powers come from the Infinity Stones, like they're still the characters that they're supposed to be, right? They still very much resemble the characters from the comics. One of the most interesting pieces for me as an MCU fan is that right from the beginning, Wanda's powers reflected the reality gem, or the reality stone from, at that point, the Aether from Thor: The Dark World. So when she rips apart all of the Ultron bots towards the end of the fight, like they disintegrate in the same way that the Aether kind of disintegrates stuff. And then Pietro's powers, his ability to move super fast, is actually, you might think time stone, but it's actually related to the space stone. So he's able to move through space at an astonishing speed. And that's it ties into like the blue of his speed effect. But they actually, like, if you go back and you kind of look at it, you look at the Tesseract and a lot of the effects that they do involved with that, it relates directly into the abilities that he has, the like sort of the visual of when he uses his powers. So it was a very cool thing that established like, hey, an Infinity Stone has the ability to grant powers. So far we've only seen that effect on humans, and we've seen it on 3 characters. We've seen it on Wanda, we've seen it on Pietro, and we've seen it on Carol Danvers, Captain Marvel. And she also, like, she's exposed to the Tesseract, but doesn't get space powers. Her powers are actually probably more closely linked to the Power Stone than any of the other ones. But they don't really look like it either. She just kind of has her own signature style with the photon blasts and stuff. But yeah, it always kind of, like, right from the beginning when they were first introduced at the end of, I believe, Winter Soldier.
Yeah,
I think
they're
they
in the
were. I
post-credit
think yeah,
scene. Yep.
yeah, they're the post-credit scene in that. We see them and it was like, oh, like this is like Hydra is doing something. They're creating mutants enhanced. I like right from the beginning there was a lot of speculation of like, where is this going to go? How far is it going to go? And getting into the most recent stuff, I mean, like, Wanda has the ability to alter reality, and is this going to be how we bring mutants into the MCU and have the X-Men established? I still maintain that the uh, 3 times that the Infinity Gauntlet was used on Earth are going to have a lasting effect on a bunch of the humans with some sort of a special genetic marker, an X gene, if you will, and that's how we're gonna introduce all of the mutants, and that'll allow us to establish that there have been mutants for about 6 or 7 years by the time that they introduce them, because they'll have existed from the snap forward. So from the first time that Thanos uses the Infinity Gauntlet, that power might go out. Anybody with an X gene has the potential to be activated, and then it happens 2 more times. The 2 more times are in very close sequence, when Hulk brings everybody back, and then when Tony uses the stone at the end of Infinity Game, and Infinity Game, Endgame. So we have those 3 instances where this cosmic infinity energy has washed over Earth. Really good opportunity for them to explain where mutants come from, but they might still use Scarlet Witch. Who knows? So that's kind of where we are with the MCU, where she fits into it. They did use her in Civil War as a proxy for mutants in order to kick Civil War off, which is interesting because it's a mutant in the comics that kicks off Civil War as well. He explodes and destroys an entire town, and that's when the government kind of comes in and goes, there should be some sort of a regulation, like we should be registering all of these metahumans. So they don't call them metahumans, that's a DC term, but all of the, like, these super people, which is a real big point of contention in the X-Men stuff all the time, is like the Mutant Registration Act is a main storyline in those comics, but it kind of never bled over into everything else until this happened with Civil War. And so it was interesting that they basically used her as the catalyst to kick that off, being that she's like the only mutant in the movies, right, in the MCU. So yeah, I don't know. Did you have any other questions about the origins of Wanda Maximoff?
No. I think that's helpful to know where she came from, in the comic world, and how they, I like that point you make about how, because obviously this probably happens a lot with the MCU, they change a lot of things about these character stories, yet remain true to kind of the heart of the character. So I think what's interesting with her kind of introduction, cinematically, um, alongside her brother, right, is and obviously WandaVision gives us a tremendous amount of backstory to everything, because we don't get much of her story in the movies. It's WandaVision that flushes this character out and almost, retroactively explains a lot of who she is. So right, we know that they're orphaned at a young age and eventually get picked up by Hydra and they become radicalized. um and it seems to imply in WandaVision that Agatha, seems to imply that she's born with this special ability in the mystic arts, and
Yeah.
the encounter with the Mind Stone isn't what necessarily gave them to her. It's just kind of what awokened it, right? And so I think that's really neat. Is uh, this is something very true in religious mythology? Is this idea that an individual has a specific skill or a specific gift that they don't become aware of until they have some sort of divine encounter. And I feel like the way that happens in Wanda's story is when we have that flashback scene of her kind of, the scientists are sending her into the room to encounter, Loki's staff, and she has this vision of the Scarlet Witch. And what I love about that, in that moment is I'm wondering, is that her seeing some like divine entity, or is that her just seeing herself, like her possible future? I don't know. I think it's left purposefully ambiguous. But my immediate thought was, oh my gosh, this is Moses with the burning bush, right? Like he has this encounter with this divine light that really shakes him up and reveals that he has this special calling. There's this special skill to him. And that's what happens to Wanda in light of this. Is she's always, according to WandaVision, she's always had these innate skills with the mystic arts. And then that encounter with the Mind Stone just kind of sends it, into overdrive, if you will. So it's really fascinating too that, in the finale of the show, we learned that the Scarlet Witch isn't born but forged. I love this idea that, she's to use Star Wars language, she's not a chosen one created by the Force itself, but rather the Scarlet Witch is a product of experience. And who better to, right? Like again, to me, like this was brilliant storytelling. As the previous episode is, we get her entire backstory. We get this history of this character who has lived through the loss of her parents, who she obviously had a beautiful relationship with. She lives through the loss of her brother, and then the loss of her beloved. So this is a character whose entire story has been so profoundly formed by loss, and it has forged her into the Scarlet Witch. So, and this is like kind of what I'll posit towards the end of our conversation, but in a lot of ways, these horrible things that happen to her become her truth that also make her who she is. So, that's it's a very typical story trope of becoming something more in the face of tragedy, right? Luke and the friggin', dead aunt and uncle, no different in a lot of ways. But yeah, like, so her story to me, and the reason this character is so compelling to me, is it's a character who is specifically defined by loss and what that loss means, and what that experience is, forge her into becoming. So as I was doing a little bit of research about this sort of character existing in religious mythology, the first thing I found was the goddess Demeter, who is a goddess known for their grief. She grieves every winter season the loss of her daughter Persephone, right, who was abducted by Hades and taken to hell. So while they strike a deal where she's allowed to be on Earth again for a time, but while she's gone, Demeter is grieving, and there's this cycle to the grief, and an even more profound religious mythological story is the story of Shiva. And Shiva is obviously one of the great Hindu gods, and he grieves the loss of, I'm probably pronouncing names wrong, I apologize, but Sati, who is his spouse. Sati dies, and Shiva becomes this destructive force. And then Sati is reborn as Parvati, and they can be happily ever after again. So the story of Shiva is the story of loss, grief, and rebirth. But in the process of all that is
Hmm.
also Shiva the iconography of Shiva is probably well known to many people. It's the image of this god dancing in the midst of a circle, and they're dancing on a demon. That's who Shiva is in Hindu traditions. So Shiva, apparently, whenever he goes into that state of mourning, he starts the dance of destruction and rebirth. So again, like, there is something sacred in the story of loss and in the story of grieving and how grief can give way to rebirth. Um, and the last thing I wanted to mention in this regard too is obviously in the Christian tradition, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there is a story about a garden called Eden, and the first person put there has this sense of emptiness, right? God creates all of these creatures, and yet nothing seems to quite fulfill this early person. So God puts them to sleep and creates out of them a companion, right? And that's where Eve comes from, out of the rib of Adam. And I think that's really neat, because when we see that beautiful moment when Wanda just bursts forth this spontaneous creation, and does what she does in Westview, it's so cool to see Vision literally being drawn out of her heart.
Hmm.
So right, it's this idea that she herself creates something out of her grief. Um, and right, there's that profound truth about how human persons are created for relationship. And I don't mean to always say that it has to be a romantic relationship, but we are created for relationship. We are created for community. And you know, when we don't have that to some capacity, we feel that lack. To use the Vision's language, right? I've never felt the lack because I've never had anyone. Um, but Wanda has. Wanda feels the lack, and there is something profoundly human about that need for companionship. Um, and so, in the midst of this grief of hers, she creates that. She creates that which she is missing. Um, but obviously, as that story kind of points out, there are also consequences, because now she's kind of uh, taken over this entire town's, and people are stripped from their own realities
Hmm.
to be duped into Wanda's. And that gives way to this, the power of her grief. Um, and I think this to me was, again, what sold me on WandaVision is, you and I were just talking before we hit the record button about, Falcon and Winter Soldier. And, you were pointing out how awesome it is, and how that Marvel's being so bold with some of its, social and political commentary,
Hmm.
through the show. And I would say in a similar way, there's an incredible boldness in WandaVision to tackle something as heavy as grief with such profound delicacy. Um, so Wanda on screen, the first time we really see the power of her grief, and this is one of my favorite scenes in the Marvel movies at this point, is when Pietro dies, when he moves in to save Hawkeye and that child, and is killed in their place. When the camera goes to Wanda and she just falls to her knees, and boom, outbursts this, just burst of energy that just destroys every agent of Ultron around her. Um, I mean, again, like I'm watching a lot of Marvel in 2 months. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In light of WandaVision, so it's easier probably than maybe for some folks who watch them over years to see some of these connections. But it just visually, again, there's this beautiful parallel to that same moment when she's standing in that empty lot in Westview that Vision had purchased for them to start a home in, and she falls to her knees and drops that deed, and this beautiful music starts, and she starts to cry, and boom, this burst of massive energy just pours out of her to reshape everything around her. It's, if somebody was like, "Oh, where'd that come from? We've never seen Wanda do that before." It's like, actually, yeah, it's one of the first things you see her do. you know,
Yeah.
is her response to the loss of her brother is to just kind of reshape aka destroy everything around her. And it almost as if it's not, it's almost like it's just uh, a reaction. It's not like willful in a way, right? Like I don't think she, in that moment in Age of Ultron, I don't think she's conscious of thinking, oh, I have to destroy this enemy around me. It's just more of she falls into grief, and that grief is powerful. And I think part of the lesson Wanda needs to learn is, how do I grieve responsibly, right? If that makes sense, and to connect to the human experience, right? Like when human beings experience loss, sometimes the easiest thing to do, right, is pick up some alcohol, pick up some drugs, pick up some destructive behaviors, to kind of deal with that grief, which is human. And I think Wanda's story is, grief is really, really powerful and can be very, very destructive and recreative. So we need to be responsible of how do we grieve. And I think that there's a certain amount of immaturity to her grief. And I don't say that in a judgmental way. I think, again, the part of the story of WandaVision is she needs to understand how powerful her grief is. And then how do I live it out? So, she is a character who lives out of her pain. And when she finally kind of accepts the truth of that pain, and I love, this is something, there's that great moment between her and Monica Rambeau, after Monica's been kind of reshaped by the hex, and they're having that face off outside her house. And she says, trust me, I know how you're feeling. I know exactly what it was like when I lost my mom. Did I screw up the Rambeaus? Is Monica the mom or the daughter?
Oh man, now you've got me questioning it.
I know. I'm pretty
you keep going, I'll double check.
Thank you. I'm pretty sure
you've got it right. I'm pretty sure
cool.
It's Monica.
But be that, yeah. So right, and she says, but I also know that this is the truth of me, and I can't change that, and I wouldn't want to, right? And I think she's offering that wisdom to Wanda of, it's okay that part of your truth is that you're someone who lost somebody.
Yep.
And and I think when Wanda kind of wakes up to that is when things start to change for her and for the town in general and for her story. So it leads me to our final question then is what does she teach us?
Sorry, yeah. I'll just really
please.
quickly before that, I will just confirm, yes, Monica Rambeau is the right character. Maria was her mother.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
They're very close. It's so close. The names are so close.
Right. Yeah. Not doing us any favors.
Yeah. Comic books.
So I think there's a word that I really, when I rewatched Age of Ultron and Infinity War and WandaVision this past week, by the way, I've had a lot of free time, y'all. And I will admit, like, this is obviously, like, this is only our second episode, but I think it's important to point out, even for maybe our own context, why the story's been especially powerful for me. I'm living through a breakup right now, and breakups are not fun experiences. They're profound experiences of loss, and they suck. Yeah. So I'm finding tremendous beauty in this story.
I think the last year for everybody has been a bit like a breakup.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a way, like I think the timing of this series was really fortuitous, almost meant to be, in a certain way. In that we are all kind of experienced with grief over the last year. We've all lost a lot. In some instances, for some people, quite literally, they have lost loved ones. And then for others of us, it's a loss of a way of life, or a lot of people have lost their jobs. A lot of people are feeling separated from family. The pandemic, just to sort of place us in time, if you're listening to this 5 years from now, you've randomly stumbled upon this podcast. Like it has been a really interesting time of grieving and kind of to your point earlier, it's like there are multiple ways to deal with grief, and one of those is destructive, and I think that a lot of people have experienced that over the last year to varying degrees. I mean, like, I can say for myself, using my I statements here, that that although, like, I didn't lose my job, I my wife and I are still happily married. Everybody in our family has been healthy. I mean, there is still like that loss of way of life. It's been very difficult with two kids to keep them entertained and occupied. And like there are opportunities. I mean, Cassie was born 8 months, no, yeah, I don't know, around 8 months before all of this started happening. So for her, it's like there are a lot of things that you do with a kid when they're under a year old that we just didn't get to do with her. And that was a bummer. And that led to some destructive behaviors. I would say definitely eating too much junk food, not getting out and exercising on my part, but also, like I'm a lot quicker to anger lately. I'm a lot easier to like tip over to that point to where I'm not just annoyed by something, but I'm like, I'll get to yelling or whatever, like things. It's just, I think that we're just all kind of feeling that heightened sensitivity that's a very similar feeling to grief. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so so I think to have this story come in and be about somebody experiencing that on in this fantastical way, right? But then it ending in this very transformative, hopeful sort of ending, as much as losing Vision and losing her children at the end. I mean, you got to watch all the way to the end, but of WandaVision, there is still hope and there is still something to fight for. And I think that where Wanda was at before WandaVision is that she felt like she didn't have anything left to fight for.
Right.
The world had changed around her in the 5 years that she was gone. Vision was dead. Her brother's dead. Her parents are dead. Like everybody, that Captain America is gone, who was a character that she was close with in the MCU. Like all of these people that were close to her have left her, and she's alone. And and she kind of reacts in the only way that she knows how to, which is very natural for her. It's very organic. But then by the end of it, it's very transformative, and she comes out of it.
Yeah.
So I think that for us, watching that, it's like, here's this example of a character with all of this power, um, going through the same thing that we're going through. So, like, hey, when I'm grieving, I don't, manipulate reality around me. So maybe it'll be even easier for me to get through it. And, my transformation at the end might not be quite so spectacular, but but it's still possible, right? Like, and I think that was one of the hopeful things about WandaVision. I think it's one of the reasons why it connected. It's just such a universal experience.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it leaves us in such a positive way, in my opinion.
Yeah.
That was my experience with it.
Yeah. Well, what I was about to say, also though, is something that connects Wanda and Vision throughout the movies, is the sense of time. So, in Infinity War, after they're rescued by Captain America and Black Widow and Falcon, they're leaving and they're kind of chastising Wanda for having not stayed better in connection, and she says, "We just wanted a little more time." Right? That there's this. Wanda's character is always coming up to the reality of time, and how time ultimately always wins, right? And I think that it kind of feeds into some of the Doctor Strange story as well, right? I can't. Who's the villain in Doctor Strange?
Well, Dormammu is the ultimate villain,
Right.
in Doctor Strange, but Caecilius is the
Caecilius,
guy
yeah.
sort of enacting his stuff.
Right. And he says to Doctor Strange in their first encounter, he says, time is the true enemy. Time kills everything, right? So it's interesting how in this story, because I know obviously in the MCU we're getting to the point where Wanda, or Scarlet Witch for that matter, and Doctor Strange are obviously going to encounter one another. It's neat that her personal story is something that is conflicted by time. And towards the end of WandaVision, after Vision has figured out the truth, and Vision is just kind of the character who's always just going to be like, we have to do what's right. I mean, right, what he asks Wanda to do at the end of Infinity War, I mean, this isn't what either of them want to happen, but it has to happen, right? The only way we can stop Thanos now is for you to destroy this stone. it's time, our time is up, right? And I love how at the end of WandaVision, it becomes very clear that she's got to let the people of this town be free again, right? Like she can't continue to allow her grief to pile on other people. And he says to her, "It's time," right? It's just like, it's very significant that the idea of time is constantly what they're running up against. And I think from, again, that very human standpoint of, we all only have so much time, especially all of us who've lost loved ones. You only have so much time with people in this life. Um, and yeah, I just think it's really, it's a very human desire to want just a little more time with a loved one you've lost, right? That beautiful flashback scene of Wanda with Vision at the Avengers headquarters, and Vision says like, "Oh, I've heard that if you talk about it, it makes things easier." She says, and she, at that point in her grief process, she says, "The only thing that would make it better is if I could see him again," referring to Petro.
Yeah.
Right. And I just think of anybody who's literally lost a loved one to death, right? What you wouldn't give for one more day. I mean, Monica admits that to Wanda, like, "I understand why you're doing this. If I had your powers, I don't know that I'd be able to stop myself from being able, so that I could see my mother one more time," right? Like, that's a very human impulse to want a little more time with the people that we love. And but at the same time, the story is going to teach us a truth, and it's the truth that Wanda learns, which is simply, you don't have forever. So, right, there's the old adage, better to have loved and lost than never have loved at all. I think that's a truth that this story is reminding us of, that, right, falling in love is always a risk. And, always a risk no matter what, even if it's a love that lasts forever. Eventually time will take one of you, and then you have
Yeah.
to experience that loss. And it's friggin' hard, but it's better to have had that experience in life than to have never taken the risk. So, Mike, if you don't mind, I'm going to play kind of this really powerful clip from the last episode of WandaVision, which I realize, at this point, we're obviously so far into the conversation, we never gave a spoiler warning, but the show's been out for a while. I feel like if you're listening, you've probably seen it.
Hey, we're talking about it. The whole series, this whole podcast series is going to be spoilers.
Okay.
So yeah, I avoided the Falcon ones. We're
Yes.
not going to get into Falcon
Right,
stuff
right.
yet, but.
But anyway, okay, so this is from their final moments together at the end of WandaVision.
I have been a voice with no body, a body but not human, and now a memory made real. And that's what I might be next. We have said goodbye before, so it stands to reason.
We'll say hello again.
I can't watch that scene without tearing up, even out of the context of the story itself. But I love that you said as much, Mike, that the story does end with tremendous hope. Right, that this loss, that the losses we experience in some way are never, in a weird way, they're never forever. And again, right, like I think speaking out of a Christian context, Christians don't believe that death is the end. Most religious traditions don't believe that death is the final end. We all have varying degrees of what the other side of that looks like. And that's a conversation for a totally different place. But the reality is the same, is that opportunity to say hello again still exists. And yeah, I that story ends with, like, Wanda, she really learns that losing someone is probably the hardest thing to experience in life. And yet the reason it's so hard is because you were given the gift of being in love. You were given the gift of having that experience. And it's something that's always worth it. And I think that that's a very profound message to be reminded of. And one final thing I'd like to do, Mike, if you don't mind, because I love music. I love talking about music, specifically on the Wampus Lair. Every May, we usually dedicate the entire month to just talking about Star Wars music, and how it's used in storytelling elements. I want to play the music from that scene, isolated from the dialogue. And the score is written by Christoph Beck, who's done a lot of the Marvel music. He did the Ant-Man movies, which, while the Ant-Man movies aren't my favorite stories, they do have some of my favorite music. He's a very gifted composer. And in one of the final tracks from the episode 9 score, the track is called "What Am I?" I'm going to just play this brief snippet of that music that's playing as they're having that conversation. And I think what's really interesting is how he's using the music to also convey the story and convey it emotionally. And notice there are two sections of strings. There are kind of these lower strings that are a little bit more earnest. They're very quick paced. Again, kind of like this reminder of, hey, time is limited, right? There's an earnestness to how we have to sometimes live out our lives. And then the higher strings are recognizing kind of the beauty of what you get to experience in that time. And then as they kind of come to we'll say hello again, you'll notice that the strings start to become in harmony, that they work together. So I'm going to this is like 30 seconds of music. So let me cue this up for us.
Cool.
So, right, this is the more earnest stuff here at the bottom. And you get the horns that are kind of celebrating it. And the higher strings are starting to come in. I just love that musical storytelling right there. You know, you've got the earnestness of life with this triumphant experience of love, and it creates this harmonious song, right? That's quite beautiful. And I think, to me, this is the story of Wanda, the character of Wanda, her lesson, I think, to all of us. And I love how you so pointedly pointed out that this message is so important a year after this pandemic that has just ravished us with grief, is the reminder that while everything is limited, there is just this tremendous power in letting ourselves take the risk of being in love and living in harmony with the fact that things have sometimes a timestamp, and yet they're still beautiful. So that, I guess, even reminds me of one of the most profound things Vision first says, which is at the end of Age of Ultron, when he says something isn't beautiful because it lasts, right? It's still beautiful, even if it's impermanent. So yeah, to me, that's what makes this character so great. She is our modern goddess of grief, who reminds us that grief is a process, and it can be destructive, and it can be really painful and hard. And yet it can also be the grounds of rebirth and something beyond what we thought was possible. Right. And Vision gives her that at the end. You know, at first I was just a computer system, and then now I'm a memory made real. Who knows what I'll be next? That is a statement of profound beauty and hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the journey of those two characters and sort of the way that they're interwoven and then come to a climax here in WandaVision is this is why we're talking about the MCU, right? There just isn't another storytelling method, I think, at least for me, that's as effective as what the MCU is doing. This is why comic books are still around despite, you know, many attempts from both human and economic forces to kill them off since they were created in the 1930s. Um, this medium, this storytelling model survives because we have the opportunity within it to really explore what it is to be human, and in the best way, in the same way. I mean, like when we bring up Greek myth, when we bring up superheroes in the same breath, it, like, there's a reason why. It's because these are modern myths in this, and they serve the same purpose that the gods did, you know, 2000, 10,000 years ago,
Mhm.
right? Like when we talk about Demeter and Persephone, we're talking about humans trying to come to grips with why do we plant seeds in the spring only to watch them wither in the fall, and just to live through death in the winter, right? Like, what? Because the seasons are what they are, and it's uncontrollable, it's outside of our purview, and especially at that point in time, it was outside of our understanding. We didn't realize that we were on a chunk of mineral spinning around a giant ball of gas on a very specific angle at a very specific distance in a very specific part of the galaxy in a specific part of the universe, and that's the only reason why any of it works, right? Like we couldn't even begin to perceive that. So what do? We concoct these stories, and we weave this tapestry of gods and demigods and humans and heroes in order to try and make some sense of our world around us, to try and put some sort of poetry and art to the chaos and suffering, because the one of the only truths of the universe is entropy, which is that everything eventually will die, right? Like eventually, like the universe exploded in a big bang, and eventually it'll stop expanding and it'll start contracting, and it'll just kind of blip back into nothing, which all goes right back into what Vision said of, but the thing is not beautiful because it lasts, right?
Mhm.
um and so now we create these mythologies with superheroes, and we don't need to explain science. We have science, we learned that in school.
Yeah.
So I don't need a superhero to explain to me why the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. I know why. um I don't need to understand the nature of the seasons. I don't need to know, you know, where life comes from. Like we have those answers, we have that science. So what don't we have answers to? Well, you know, grief is one of those things. Grief, where do we go when we die? What happens to us? Which I think is a very big part of the story here of like what is Vision, and what, when she restores him, is that Vision, or is that a facsimile of Vision? And then we, in the very specific instance of this character, because it is science fiction, because it is mythology, we can have the body of Vision reanimated and separate, and even have the mind intact but without the soul, right? He has all of the memories, he has all of the knowledge of the Vision, but he is not Vision. He's not Viz, right? Like, he's not that person. And what is that magical thing that's missing, and is part of it still inside Wanda, right? And I, like, to me, that's the final lesson of it, is that it's not that Viz or her children disappear or are destroyed. They go back to where they were before she created the construct, right? Before she created this alternate reality that she was controlling, and allowed them to exist outside of her, which is why when it collapses, they collapse with it, right?
Mhm.
Because it's only within that construct, within that spell, that they're able to, within the hex, that they're able to survive. So that part of her, that part of Viz is still inside of her. The part that is the Mind Stone, right? That part that in Infinity War we're worried, like if we remove the Mind Stone, is he still Vision? And we've still got those other parts of Vision out there. We have the answer to that question, which is like, is he still Vision? And we get the whole Ship of Theseus thing, which when we eventually circle back around and we do an episode about Vision, we'll dig into more. But it is like for Wanda, I think it's this realization that no matter what, like that effect that Vision, that effect that Pietro and her parents and all of the people around her have had on her, like we live on in the people that we influence. And if we ever get into a conversation about afterlife and what that means and what where do we go when we die, we have that conversation. I am of the opinion that I if there is an afterlife, it's the quality of it is definitely determined by the mark that you left on the people in your life, right? That if you were loved, then then you never really die. And maybe that's a metaphysical thing, maybe that's just a philosophical thing, I don't know, but I don't have the answer to that. But to me, like that's kind of where we end up with this is Vision is never gone as long as Wanda is still there.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, within the mechanics of the Marvel universe, she's going to try and figure out a way to bring back her children and her husband, um but just from like the lesson learned and the spiritual component of it, I think that there is definitely a good lesson to be gleaned from that. In that, as long as it's the love persevering thing, right? What is grief but love persevering? Like that is just like, it continues even though the person is gone. They're just not there to express it to, right? And that can be because they're physically gone, they've died, or they are just not present. They've in the instance of, like you said, like a breakup, right? That's grief. It's like there is a feeling and it is not returned. It has no place to go, so it just kind of circles in on itself, right?
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
but understanding that like that feeling, don't let it become a bitter thing, don't let it become destructive, don't let it become hurtful, because the privilege just to have gotten it in the first place is something that not everybody gets to have, right?
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
so
Yeah.
that's kind of that to me is the biggest takeaway.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
right there is the takeaway.
Absolutely. And what they, even in the instance of I think the loss of a loved one to death is a very different type of grieving than a loss of someone from a breakup, right? Like the other person's
Yeah.
still around, you still care for one another, but you can't be together anymore for, always, there are always reasons. Um, and I think they're both very hard, but I think, like you're saying, the reality is the impact the love that you shared, that never goes away, right? um Whether the person is gone because of death, or because the person is gone because life no longer works out together, the love that you shared, that always stays with you, and that makes you a better person, ideally. um and yeah, and I think, like you said, that's the lesson of Wanda, in this big, grandiose, crazy story, is a very human story that reminds us that our grief is very powerful, and it's something worth letting out,
Mm.
and processing through, so that we can better understand the beauty of what we've experienced in life, and hold on to the hope that uh, that powerful experience you had, you will have again, hopefully. So
You said something just now that I just want to kind of riff on a little bit, which is that like that idea that even when we lose someone, hopefully, just the experience of being with them has made us a better person, right? And I think the important thing that Wanda learns in this, and the important thing for a lot of us to take away from it, is that whether or not you become a better person, or whether or not, like, let's use a breakup as an example, because I think this is something we can all relate to, especially high school breakups, right? I Oftentimes we choose the quicker and easier route, which is to just get bitter and spiteful and not like the other person, because we we kind of make that becoming a better person thing contingent on the other person,
Mhm.
like on an outside force. We It's just human nature. We want other people to do the hard work. We don't want to do the hard work ourselves, right? um but especially in these instances, and instances of grief and of growth from it, the only person who can ultimately make you a better person is you, right? Like, it's like the mind stone, the scarlet witch, whatever, none of that stuff is important. These are all just external forces or internalized things. But but ultimately it's up to Wanda to choose, and it's in that moment when the all of the townspeople are kind of coming towards her and going like, just let us die or whatever, right? And she's going like, she has to make a choice. Is she going to continue to allow her grief to hurt other people, or is she going to deal with it and grow from it, right? And Vision can't do that for her. Her children can't do that for her. Agatha can't do that for her, right? It has to be a decision that she makes, and it has to be something that she works on herself, right? And I think that, to me, is really key in understanding, um sort of like the positive outcome of this story, because I remember seeing when WandaVision ended, there was a lot of discourse about like, oh, I wanted her to have a happy ending, could have these things that she gained, right? And it's like, yeah, but it is a happy ending, because by the end of it, she's come into her power, she understands it, and she's in control of it. Whereas I think what you've been talking about a lot, we've kind of been talking in circles around, is that, like, when that grief explodes out of her and rips those Ultron bots to shreds, she's not in control.
Yeah.
When she comes to Westview and she stands in the middle of that empty lot and she breaks down, and that energy explodes out of her and transforms the town and creates the hex, she's not in control, right? But in that post-credit scene, her physical body is walking around, like sitting outside, walking around, making a cup of tea, and her power is contained and controlled and doing the work in the back room,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Like, what a transformation for that character, what a difference. And the outfit and everything definitely exemplifies that. She went from all of these different outfits that were like, kind of, I always loved the design of Scarlet Witch in the MCU. I love all of her costumes that she's had, but they always felt a little bit off to me. And then you see her in her final form in WandaVision, and it was like, finally, that's her.
Hmm.
That's Wanda. That's the Scarlet Witch, and it's because she's finally in control of her power. She's finally fully realized it. One thing that I'll point out to people that maybe you haven't noticed, go back and look at the costume. So she's kind of got this almost like a necklace design. It's like a halter top to it, right? Where it's like got the sleeveless, but it's kind of got that almost like a choker around her neck. And right in the center of it, there's a shape. It's a hexagon, but it's an elongated hexagon. It's the exact same shape as Vision's Mind Stone,
Mm.
right? Because the Mind Stone itself is kind of a jaggedy, like, right? It's not a perfect shape. But when it was integrated into Vision, it had that perfect hexagonal, like that elongated hexagonal prism shape to it, right? And that shape is right there, like basically like, just below her throat, I think. Um, Sort of like that solar plexus, which when you look at chakras and stuff, it's in an important place, basically where the heart chakra is. It's like it, and it's the center of her power, is the Mind Stone, but it's not there. There's not actually a stone there. It's just a hole, right?
Yeah.
But she created that outfit. She recognizes that hole, but it's not like something is missing. It's just a part of it, right? And that, man, the visual design of these characters is something that I think a lot of people take for granted. They just kind of, oh, that looks cool. Oh, Captain America looks neat. But the costume designers and the concept artists that work in the MCU, I believe it's Andy Park that did that suit. They go the extra mile. They put it in there, and it's legit. So I just wanted to point that out. I've said everything I need to say. We can wrap it up now. We've been talking for a while.
Yeah, that was great.
Cool. Well, awesome. Thank you, Karl, for leading us through that one. I'm excited to jump into more of these. We haven't decided who we're doing next. We haven't decided what the next episode is yet. We're gonna kind of put together a bit of a content calendar for ourselves so that we know what's coming up and can prep for it and stuff. But we'll be back soon with another episode to talk about another Marvel Cinematic Universe character. I don't know. My vote's always going to be to go into Tony, but we could talk about Spider-Man. We could talk about Doctor Strange. We could talk about Captain Marvel. There's a lot of characters. Actually, Captain Marvel is probably too early. There's not a lot of content there. But we'll be back soon with another episode. Thank you guys for listening. If you're a Patreon supporter at the $5 level or above, you'll also be getting a brand new episode of Off the Record this week. You're getting a double dose this week because Karl wanted to come back and do this episode real quick. So lucky you guys, you're getting some extra content. But yeah, we're kind of on our regular schedule now. I think. I don't know. I need to look at my calendar, figure it out. But in any case, thank you, Karl. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we will see you on the next one. Metaphysical Fiction is part of the Thunderquack Podcast Network. Head to thunderquack.com for more great podcasts, or follow us at ThunderquackPod on Twitter and Thunderquack Podcast on Instagram.